What's up everybody? Recently, I got my gold symbol in Pokemon Emerald's Battle Factory. This facility was pretty tough, and I struggled quite a bit. So I thought I'd share some tips I picked up along the way so that hopefully you have an easier time than I did. First up, if possible, you should definitely complete the Battle Factory before you attempt the Battle Tower. There is a coding error in Emerald that causes your factory opponent's IVs to scale with your tower streak instead of your factory streak. If your tower streak is 0, your opponent's Pokemon will have minimum IVs. If you don't understand what IVs are or why this is a big advantage, be sure to check out my EV and IV guide. Speaking of IVs, it is actually optimal to swap Pokemon frequently. The Pokemon available in the initial draft of each round will actually become more powerful with better IVs and movesets if you swap often. In later rounds of the Battle Factory, your team composition becomes much more important. So what I recommend is to swap as many times as you can in rounds 1 and 2. It's much better to lose your streak here because of a bad swap than it is in a later round. After you complete round 2, don't worry as much about swapping and worry more about your team composition. Swap when you can, but focus more on winning battles at this point. By the time you reach the gold symbol battle, you should at least have 1 or 2 strong Pokemon to choose from while drafting. Next, I want to talk about the actual team composition and the drafting process. This might be an obvious tip, but be sure you have good type coverage. You always want to draft Pokemon that cover each other's weaknesses. For example, a team of Salamence, Dragonite, and Sceptile may sound good, and all of these Pokemon are good individually, but you will likely lose to the first Pokemon you see that knows Ice Beam, since all 3 of these Pokemon share a common weakness to Ice. If you're running a Pokemon like Salamence that has a 4 times weakness to Ice, you'll want to find a team member that can switch into Ice moves easily, such as Blaziken or Metagross. You'll also want to avoid having too many Pokemon that perform the same role. Salamence and Dragonite have the exact same typing and share many similar movesets in the Battle Factory. Pokemon that can perform the same role add redundancy and will win or lose to the exact same opponents. It is much better to select a team that can do well against a large variety of opposing Pokemon. While drafting, you should always be sure to look at movesets, natures, and held items in the Pokemon's summary screen. This will tell you what role a Pokemon may perform and give you some useful insight as to what strategies you can use. Plus, the Battle Factory often offers good Pokemon with pretty crappy movesets, especially in earlier rounds, which are good to avoid when possible. Make sure you know exactly what your moves and items do before you actually enter a battle. Another big thing to keep in mind is the order of your draft. This is really only important when choosing your lead. Choosing your lead Pokemon wisely can greatly increase your success. The idea is to choose a Pokemon that you won't need to switch out of battle turn 1. Speedy Pokemon with good coverage are probably the best leads, however you can gain a lot of momentum other ways. Some good things to look for in lead Pokemon are moves such as Reflect and Light Screen, status moves like Toxic, ways to prevent setup such as Roar, Baton Pass for pivoting, and even Explosion or Self-Destruct. Abilities like Intimidate are pretty good for leads too. Your lead Pokemon should be able to help your team in some way even if the type matchup is not favorable. Additionally to a lead, when team building, you should try to have at least 1 bulky pivoting Pokemon and at least 1 sweeper as a win condition. The role of the bulky pivot is to switch into attacks that would KO other members of your team. This Pokemon should also have some way of dealing damage back and countering offensive threats. I've noticed that the best Pokemon for this role tend to be bulky water or normal types. Some water types I used that performed really well are Slowbro, Slowking, Wailord in really early rounds, and Suicune. Normal types that worked well for me were Blissey, Porygon 2 was excellent, and Snorlax. If you see a Snorlax, it is honestly almost always a good idea to draft it. Most of its sets are really good, although I used the Belly Drum set one time and it was a little too high risk for me, so I swapped it for something else that round. The Sweeper is the Pokemon you should use to get most of your KOs. It is good to have a sweeper whose weaknesses are covered by your bulky pivot. These Pokemon will typically have a strong setup move such as Dragon Dance, Swords Dance, or Calm Mind, but Pokemon with items like a Choice Band could probably fill this role as well. Some of the best sweepers that you should probably always look for are Salamence, Metagross, Tyranitar, and Heracross. Pokemon with many special coverage moves like Dragonite, Latias or Latios, and Starmie are pretty good too. The Battle Factory contains many Pokemon with pretty annoying movesets that can cost you your streak if you aren't prepared for them. One of the most common are Pokemon who spam evasion moves like Double Team. Make sure you have a way to defeat these Pokemon. The best is probably a strong Pokemon with the move Aerial Ace, because Aerial Ace cannot miss. If you don't have this, you could probably get around this by using Toxic and stalling, or by wall breaking with powerful moves before the setup gets too out of hand. A move like Roar could help with this as well, but Roar will fail if the Pokemon can't be switched out. Another super annoying thing is Attract. It is ideal to have Pokemon that aren't all the same gender to avoid annoying Attract strategies. Genderless Pokemon such as Metagross and Starmie are immune to Attract and are actually very good for this. Metagross is exceptional for avoiding annoying factory strategies because it is immune to Attract and it is also immune to Toxic. Toxic stalling with evasion moves is pretty common. Honestly, as a general rule of thumb, you should probably draft a Metagross anytime you see it. Last up are some pretty general tips. The first is that there is an item clause for opposing trainers. This means that your opponent will never have more than one of the same item on their team. This is good to know when gathering information on what Pokemon may be remaining, or to know if items such as Lumberry have already been used so you can freely use status moves. The next thing to note is that the scientist will give you hints about your opponent's team between battles. If they say that a trainer specializes in using a certain type, they are guaranteed to have at least 2 Pokemon of that typing. Finally, the last tip I have is to check Bulbapedia's list of possible Pokemon in the factory. This list covers everything you can encounter and is useful for knowing what moves your opponent can use and to help figure out the movesets of Pokemon you might want to swap for. This isn't super useful in early rounds, but it is really good information later on as you approach your battle with Nolan. If you're curious, this is the team that I had used to earn my gold symbol. With these tips, I hope you can do the same. Thank you all for watching, and good luck with your Battle Factory Challenge.